Ladies and gentlemen, today we stand at the edge of one of the most explosive moments in recent political and judicial history. Representative Jasmine Crockett has launched a bold and unprecedented challenge against the very institution that shapes the course of justice in our nation, the Supreme Court. This is not just a routine legal battle or a political disagreement, it is a confrontation that cuts to the core of accountability, transparency, and truth. What makes this moment even more shocking is its direct connection to the Epstein files, documents and revelations that have long lingered in the shadows, whispered about but rarely confronted at the highest levels of power. Now, those shadows are being pulled into the light, and the question of who knew what, and who was complicit, is no longer one that can be ignored. The stakes could not be higher, because at the center of this storm is not only Crockett's fearless stand against the 9 justices, but also the credibility of the judiciary itself, the weight of public trust, and the demand for justice in one of the most controversial scandals of our era. Representative Jasmine Crockett's challenge to the Supreme Court marks an extraordinary moment in American political and judicial history because it pushes the boundaries of what has typically been seen as untouchable within the nation's legal framework. The Supreme Court, by design, has been viewed as the final arbiter of justice, standing above the political fray, immune to the challenges that legislators and politicians regularly face. By confronting all 9 justices directly, Crockett is not merely questioning the outcomes of particular decisions or criticizing judicial philosophy, she is taking aim at the very concept of accountability at the highest level of the judiciary. This act resonates deeply in a time when public faith in institutions is strained, when the notion that some individuals or groups can exist beyond scrutiny has become intolerable for a growing segment of the population. Crockett's move, whether viewed as bold leadership or political risk, shines a light on how essential accountability is to sustaining democracy itself. The significance of this challenge lies in the very foundation of the Supreme Court's authority, which depends not on the force of arms but on the belief of the people in its legitimacy. For centuries, the court has operated under a kind of shield, with lifetime appointments insulating justices from the pressures of politics, and with very little in the way of external checks beyond the difficult process of impeachment. Crockett's direct confrontation exposes how fragile that arrangement can appear in the modern era, where transparency and accountability are demanded more urgently than ever before. In her challenge, she underscores the idea that no institution, however revered, should exist without mechanisms to ensure that its members uphold the highest ethical and moral standards. This strikes at the heart of the debate over whether the court has drifted too far from the principles of impartiality and integrity that once earned it near universal respect. The courage of Crockett's challenge also reveals the shifting dynamics of political discourse in America. In an era where boldness often defines leadership, her willingness to place herself in the crosshairs of criticism demonstrates a readiness to sacrifice personal political safety for the sake of principle. This willingness to question authority at the highest level resonates with citizens who feel increasingly alienated from institutions that seem to operate in closed circles of privilege and power. By stepping into this arena, Crockett is also shaping her own political identity as someone who is not afraid to speak truth to power, even when the stakes are enormous. Her actions force other lawmakers, commentators, and the public to grapple with questions they might otherwise avoid. Should justices be subject to greater oversight, and what does it mean for a democracy when those at the top appear immune from accountability? The historical context makes Crockett's stand even more dramatic. Rarely have politicians taken on the Supreme Court so directly, as the risks often outweigh the potential rewards. Past criticisms of the court have tended to be muted, diplomatic, or framed in legalistic language that preserves the aura of respect for the judiciary. Crockett's approach departs from this pattern entirely, signaling a shift toward a more confrontational style of oversight that refuses to bow to tradition simply because it is tradition. Her message is that the Constitution may enshrine judicial independence, but it also enshrines equality under the law, and that independence cannot mean impunity. This reframing of the conversation challenges long-standing assumptions about the balance of power, reminding the public that the court is not above the people it serves, but rather accountable to them. Underlying this confrontation is a recognition that the Supreme Court does not exist in a vacuum. Its decisions shape the laws that govern every American, and its moral authority has implications that extend far beyond the courtroom. When the public loses faith in the judiciary, the consequences ripple through society, weakening the rule of law itself. Crockett's challenge therefore becomes more than a political maneuver, it becomes a test of whether democracy can adapt to ensure that even its most powerful institutions are not shielded from criticism and reform. In an age of growing political polarization, this act draws attention to the need for a renewed conversation about judicial ethics, transparency, and the responsibilities that come with wielding such extraordinary influence. The symbolism of one lawmaker standing up against all 9 justices cannot be overlooked. It is a stark visual representation of individual courage against institutional power, the kind of imagery that resonates deeply in the American political imagination. It evokes the long tradition of reformers, whistleblowers, and truth-tellers who dared to confront entrenched authority in the name of justice. For Crockett, the personal and political risks are significant, but so too are the potential rewards in terms of shifting the national conversation. Even if the immediate outcomes of her challenge are uncertain, the act itself ensures that the question of judicial accountability is no longer relegated to the sidelines. It forces both lawmakers and citizens to grapple with the reality that reform of the Supreme Court may not be a distant hypothetical, but an urgent necessity. The connection to the broader political climate also matters. At a time when Americans are divided over almost every issue, there remains a shared concern about corruption, secrecy, and the abuse of power. Crockett's move taps into this collective unease by targeting the very institution that many believe has drifted away from the ideals of impartiality. By demanding accountability, she is aligning herself with the public's hunger for transparency, honesty, and fairness. This allows her to transcend partisan boundaries and speak to a universal desire for justice that resonates across the political spectrum. Her challenge may be framed within the controversies of the day, but its deeper appeal lies in its call for integrity at the highest level of governance. The impact of this challenge may also reverberate beyond the immediate moment. By setting this precedent, Crockett is opening the door for future lawmakers, activists, and even ordinary citizens to question the legitimacy of unchecked power. She is showing that the Supreme Court, like any other institution, must be willing to evolve, to respond to criticism, and to earn the trust of the people it governs. This kind of pressure, though uncomfortable for the justices, is necessary to preserve the vitality of democracy itself. Without it, institutions risk calcifying into symbols of authority that no longer serve the people, but only themselves. By daring to confront the court now, Crockett is planting the seeds for a broader movement that insists on accountability as the cornerstone of justice. The explosive connection between the Epstein files and the credibility of America's institutions lies at the heart of a growing crisis of trust that stretches far beyond one individual or scandal. For years, the Epstein case has lingered as a dark shadow over the highest circles of power, with whispers, leaks, and partial revelations hinting at networks of influence, corruption, and exploitation that may extend into the very institutions meant to protect the public. The files themselves represent more than evidence tied to one man, they symbolize the uncomfortable truth that accountability has not always reached those at the top. When these documents resurface in the public eye, especially in connection to a confrontation with the Supreme Court, they do more than reveal sordid details, they strike at the credibility of the judiciary, the political establishment, and the mechanisms of governance that depend on public faith to function. At the core of the Epstein files is the question of who knew what and when. Names linked to these documents raise suspicions of complicity or negligence, sparking outrage that individuals in positions of immense power might have ignored or even protected abusive systems. This creates a dangerous rift between citizens and their government, as many begin to believe that a hidden tier of society exists where laws do not apply in the same way. When these suspicions are left unaddressed, they corrode trust in every branch of government, and no institution escapes the stain of doubt. The Supreme Court, already under scrutiny for issues of ethics and impartiality, becomes particularly vulnerable when its credibility is juxtaposed against the secrecy and alleged cover-ups embedded in the Epstein scandal. The intertwining of these files with institutional credibility reveals how fragile the public's trust has become. Scandals tied to money, influence, and abuse of power are not new, but the persistence of the Epstein story resonates because it suggests a network of elite protection that crosses party lines, government agencies, and even international borders. When such a network appears immune from real accountability, citizens are left to wonder whether institutions designed to uphold justice are complicit in shielding wrongdoing rather than exposing it. This is why the release, discussion, or even hint of new revelations in the Epstein files causes such seismic reactions. It is not merely curiosity about scandalous details, it is the fear that the system itself is compromised at its core. The challenge presented here is not just about facts contained within the files but about perception. Public perception plays a critical role in sustaining the authority of America's institutions. If the perception takes hold that the judiciary, lawmakers, or enforcement agencies are more interested in protecting powerful names than protecting justice, then the legitimacy of these institutions begins to collapse. This is particularly dangerous for the Supreme Court, which relies entirely on its credibility to uphold its decisions. The court has no military power, no enforcement agency of its own, it depends on the respect and trust of the people. The connection to the Epstein files threatens to erode that respect in ways that could fundamentally undermine the institution's ability to operate. The deeper the public digs into the Epstein files, the more it exposes systemic vulnerabilities. There are questions about how certain individuals managed to avoid scrutiny for years, how financial networks supported criminal behavior, and how those in power seemed blind to patterns of exploitation. Each of these questions circles back to the institutions tasked with oversight and justice. Where were the safeguards? Why did the system fail? These unanswered questions create a narrative that America's institutions are not merely flawed but actively broken, manipulated, or corrupt. That perception, whether accurate in every detail or not, becomes a force of its own, reshaping how citizens view the judiciary, the political system, and the broader idea of justice in society. The credibility crisis deepens further when the files are tied directly to the Supreme Court, because this institution represents the pinnacle of legal authority. Any suspicion, however indirect, that justices might be influenced, compromised, or unwilling to pursue justice in cases tied to the powerful, compounds the sense that accountability is selective. Even if no direct involvement exists, the association alone is damaging, because it highlights how intertwined elite networks are with the perception of untouchable privilege. Crockett's challenge intensifies this connection by dragging it into the public sphere, refusing to let the court stand apart from the storm of accountability that others have long demanded. By doing so, she ensures that the credibility of the court itself becomes part of the larger conversation about Epstein and the hidden power structures his files symbolize. The implications are vast because once trust is lost in one institution, it spreads like a contagion to others. If the Supreme Court cannot be trusted, then how can its rulings on the Constitution, individual rights, or the balance of power be accepted without skepticism? If government agencies are suspected of shielding elite figures in scandals like Epstein's, then how can they be trusted to investigate corruption elsewhere? If lawmakers appear hesitant to confront these questions, then how can citizens believe that their representatives are truly working for them rather than protecting their own ranks? This is how the credibility crisis becomes systemic, threatening not just one branch of government but the entire fabric of democratic governance. The explosive nature of the Epstein files lies in their ability to pull back the curtain on these interconnections. They serve as a reminder that accountability is not optional but essential, and that institutions cannot hide behind tradition or authority when their legitimacy is in doubt. Each revelation, each new connection, amplifies the demand for transparency, shining a light on how far institutions must go to regain public confidence. For some, this becomes a rallying cry for reform, for stronger safeguards, for ethical codes with real consequences. For others, it becomes proof that the system is too corrupted to be fixed from within. Either way, the credibility of America's institutions hangs in the balance, caught between the weight of past secrecy and the demand for present accountability. This tension is why the Epstein files continue to generate such explosive reactions. They are not merely about crimes of the past, they are about the health of democracy in the present. They call into question whether the nation's institutions are capable of living up to their stated ideals of justice and equality, or whether they have been co-opted by the very forces they claim to resist. The files serve as both a symbol and a catalyst, forcing uncomfortable truths into the open and demanding that the guardians of law and order confront their own role in either perpetuating or dismantling corruption. The credibility of the Supreme Court, and of the broader American system, now stands intertwined with how this scandal is confronted, investigated, and resolved, and the echoes of that connection will reverberate through history for years to come. The broader impact on public trust, political integrity, and the future of transparency in governance is one of the most profound consequences of Representative Crockett's challenge and the explosive re-emergence of the Epstein files. At its core, this situation is not just about legal arguments or judicial accountability. It is about whether citizens can believe in the institutions that govern their lives and whether those institutions are willing to embrace the scrutiny necessary to maintain that belief. Public trust is the bedrock of democracy, and without it, even the most carefully designed system begins to fracture. The controversy swirling around the Supreme Court and the revelations connected to Epstein expose how fragile that trust has become, and how quickly it can erode when transparency is replaced by secrecy or when political integrity is sacrificed for self-preservation. Public trust is not built overnight, nor is it destroyed in a single moment. It accumulates over years of consistent actions, decisions, and perceptions. When citizens see leaders acting with integrity, when courts appear impartial, and when laws are enforced equally, trust grows. However, when scandals emerge that suggest double standards, protection of elites, or lack of accountability, the damage is far greater because it confirms long-held suspicions that ordinary people play by one set of rules while the powerful play by another. The Epstein scandal, intertwined with the credibility of institutions like the Supreme Court, amplifies this divide. The public sees in it a symbol of privilege shielded from consequence, and each unanswered question or hidden file becomes another crack in the foundation of trust. Political integrity is deeply tied to how leaders respond in moments like these. Integrity is not measured by how officials act when times are easy, but by whether they are willing to confront uncomfortable truths and hold even the most powerful accountable. Crockett's decision to challenge the Supreme Court directly is seen by many as an act of integrity because it rejects the culture of silence and deference that has protected institutions for too long. In doing so, she places political integrity above political convenience, choosing to address issues that others have avoided out of fear of backlash. Her actions call into question the integrity of others who remain silent or who attempt to dismiss the significance of these revelations. The contrast between those who demand accountability and those who retreat into protection of the status quo becomes sharper, and the public begins to judge political leaders not only by their words but by their willingness to confront corruption. The future of transparency in governance depends heavily on how this moment unfolds. Transparency is no longer a political slogan, it is a necessity in a world where information circulates freely and secrecy is harder to maintain. When files like those connected to Epstein are hidden, redacted, or shielded from the public, suspicion only grows stronger. Transparency is the antidote to that suspicion, but it requires courage from institutions to open themselves up to scrutiny and to accept that exposure is part of accountability. If the Supreme Court, Congress, and other governing bodies resist transparency in this moment, they risk deepening the perception that they are more committed to protecting themselves than to serving the people. On the other hand, embracing transparency, even when it reveals uncomfortable truths, can restore faith in governance by showing that no one is above the law. The broader impact of these revelations also reaches into the cultural and social fabric of the nation. Public trust in institutions is not an abstract concept, it shapes how people view their role in society. When citizens believe the system is fair, they are more likely to participate, to vote, to engage in civic life, and to respect the rule of law. When they believe the system is rigged, they disengage, withdraw, or seek alternatives outside of democratic norms. The stakes of this credibility crisis are therefore not just political but existential, as they determine whether future generations will inherit a system that commands respect or one that has collapsed under the weight of mistrust. The erosion of trust also has international consequences. America's institutions are not only scrutinized at home but also watched abroad as symbols of democracy. When scandals like Epstein's are tied to a lack of accountability in the United States, they weaken America's moral authority on the global stage. Other nations question whether American calls for transparency and human rights are credible when its own institutions appear compromised. This has implications for diplomacy, alliances, and the global struggle between democratic and authoritarian models of governance. Transparency and integrity within the United States therefore reverberate far beyond its borders, influencing how the country is perceived and how its values are adopted or rejected elsewhere. Another dimension of the broader impact is the way it reshapes political debate. Issues of transparency and accountability are not confined to one party or ideology, they cut across the political spectrum. Scandals that appear to implicate both liberals and conservatives alike blur partisan lines and force citizens to confront the deeper systemic issues rather than framing everything through the lens of party loyalty. This can lead to new coalitions of people demanding reform, united not by ideology but by the shared belief that integrity in governance is non-negotiable. It can also expose those who prefer to maintain the old order, revealing who is committed to change and who benefits from secrecy. Technology plays a critical role in this evolving landscape of transparency. With digital platforms, leaks, and investigative reporting, it is harder than ever for institutions to contain information. The Epstein files, like other scandals, circulate quickly and widely, shaping narratives before institutions have time to respond. This forces governments to adapt to a new era in which transparency is often imposed by circumstance rather than offered willingly. The public no longer waits patiently for official statements, it demands immediate access to the truth, and any delay is interpreted as concealment. The future of transparency in governance will depend on whether institutions learn to embrace this reality and proactively share information rather than clinging to outdated notions of secrecy. The psychological impact of these events on the public should not be overlooked. Scandals like Epstein's erode not only trust in institutions but also personal confidence in justice itself. Citizens begin to question whether it is worth fighting for fairness if the system appears stacked against them. Restoring that sense of justice requires visible acts of integrity and transparency from leaders willing to risk their own standing for the sake of the greater good. Crockett's challenge represents one such act, but it also sets a high bar for others who must follow. Without a collective commitment to integrity, the damage to public trust will deepen, and democracy will suffer the consequences. Ultimately, the broader impact of this crisis lies in the choices made now by leaders, institutions, and the public. Public trust cannot be demanded, it must be earned. Political integrity cannot be faked, it must be demonstrated. Transparency cannot be partial, it must be full and uncompromising. The challenge to the Supreme Court and the revelations tied to the Epstein files present an inflection point where the future of governance is being shaped. Whether the nation moves toward greater accountability or deeper mistrust will depend on how seriously this moment is taken and how willing institutions are to prove that they are truly accountable to the people they serve.